So today we're going, as I said, we're going to be studying color by making a version of a color wheel, or actually 3 color wheels. We're actually going to be making color stars, which I'll explain in detail in a few minutes. But it's a way that we're going to go about studying what the possibilities of color mixing are. So I'm going to be introducing that to you. Color mixing with a full palette. These exercises are designed to introduce you, to begin to get you thinking about what is the range of colors you can achieve with the colors we have. So again, just to bring this into the progression we've made in the class so far. So we started the class using just white and Payne's gray, which, as everybody knows now, is a kind of blue-black. And we studied the principles of light and shadow on a simple form. So we were studying light and shadow on an egg, and everybody completed a painting something like this. Working with, or starting to know, to identify and to apply the basic principles of light and shadow. So seeing light mass, dark mass, cast shadow, reflected light, core of the shadow, reflected light, occlusion shadow or shadow accent, what halftones are and how we use them, how to use highlights, and how to put all those elements together to start to build a clear sense of volume in the objects we're trying to paint, volume and space. So in this painting by Luis Melendez, we can see all of those elements working for the artist in this relatively complete, I don't know why I say relatively, in this complete painting. This is a detail of a larger still life. So we see the light, and hopefully everybody at this point can identify these elements. We can see the light mass, the dark mass, cast shadow, and so on. So all of those elements at play in this complex, fully realized painting of 3-dimensional volumes in space, and in this case, pairs on a tabletop. Then we talked about how we can combine a concept that I call planar structure, can be used in conjunction with light and shadow to, as fully as possible, create that sense or that illusion of 3-dimensional volume in space, and how we can think about a kind of pure idea of planar geometric forms and how they may respond to light and shadow, and then how we can interpret an organic form according to the principles of planar structure and the way we can understand the light and shadow, creating that sense of volume through an understanding of the object as a planar structure responding to light. And hopefully people have started to understand the way we can take this simplified understanding and apply it to more complex forms. We started to build a color sense by adding to that one, or to those 2 colors we started with, white and black. I realize some people say those aren't colors, but for our purposes, I think of them as color, part of our color palette. We added to white and Payne's gray transparent red oxide. So we made a warm, cool painting. We moved on to our painting of a drapery using a limited palette. So to our warm, cool palette of white, Payne's gray, and transparent red oxide, we added yellow ochre and ultramarine blue, and used those colors to create this limited palette, or I also referred to the palette as a Spanish palette or a dead palette. Those terms are roughly interchangeable, Like many terms artists use, they aren't precisely defined anywhere, but the palette we used was basically a Spanish palette, or sometimes referred to as a dead palette. And we created a painting of a more complex form, in this case, a drapery. And so now we're moving on to starting to think about a full spectrum palette and how we can use a full spectrum palette. So we've looked at this color wheel before. This is Johannes Itten's color wheel. It's the kind of traditional color wheel painters and artists, I shouldn't say artists generally, it's more, it is introduced to artists, but it's more specific, I think, to painters, because certain other categories of artists, let's say photographers, deal with actually a different set of colors as a base of in this case, color photography. And I'll actually talk about that. Anyway, this is the traditional color wheel. And we talked briefly about the color wheel and what it and how it is designed to help artists. So the color wheel reveals for us the primary colors, blue, red, yellow, and as we discussed, in theory, you can mix any colors with these three colors. And the color wheel shows us a sequence of mixtures. So the primary is mixed to give us the secondaries, green, violet, orange, placed on the color wheel strategically so that the color wheel shows us the primaries, the secondaries, the tertiaries. So the colors mixed between the primaries and secondaries. So between blue and violet, we get blue-violet. Between red and violet, we get violet-red. And I suppose, or I'm just noticing actually, I guess for the first time, that Itten doesn't include, some color wheels include both secondary colors. I mean, both of the tertiary colors, if we can say both tertiary colors. In other words, some color wheels include blue-violet and violet-blue. So they break this down into two shades, one closer to violet, one closer to blue, and so on throughout the color wheel. The other thing we talked about in terms of what, I'm not even sure I mentioned this yet, so let me just say the color wheel also helps us know what the color opposites. So color opposites or complementary colors, those are synonymous terms. Color opposites and complementary colors. Those are colors that sit directly across from each other on the color wheel. So blue, orange, yellow, violet, red, green, yellow, green, red, violet, and so on. And not only do those colors, when placed next to each other, emphasize the vibrance of each of the colors. So if you place blue next to an orange, at least in theory, you emphasize the vibrance of each of those colors. The other thing that color wheel and color opposites helps us to understand, and this is where I think it's most helpful for our purposes in this attempt to create convincing illusionistic paintings, is that it indicates certain color combinations that we can use to gray colors down or to neutralize colors. So a way to make a blue less vibrant than it appears in its pure form, sometimes a good way to do that is to add its opposite, which is orange. A good way to neutralize or to gray down yellow would be to add its opposite, violet. Now, that's not to say you are necessarily always going to do that. It's not to say you're necessarily always going to gray down yellow by adding violet, but it's often a good way to start thinking about how you can gray down colors or neutralize colors, which is something we will be doing frequently in this class. The other place that helps us is It helps us think about how we can make appropriate shadow colors for certain objects. So let's just say, for example, if you're painting a lemon, which some people did in one of the assignments, and you want to make, or you're trying to make the color of the shadows on a lemon, it's possible that the best route to go to create the color of the shadows on a lemon as you perceive them would be to take yellow and add violet to it. Now, there's no absolute rules in color mixing or really anything else in art, so that's not necessarily absolutely true, but it's often a useful guide when you're trying to achieve certain colors. And that's, again, in theory, true of all color opposites. So you can neutralize and darken a red by adding green, or sometimes that's a very useful way to go. You can neutralize and darken blue or orange by adding the opposite, and so on. In theory, when you mix equal amounts of orange and blue, or orange and blue, you get a neutral gray, a middle gray. In theory, that's true of violet and yellow, green and red, and so on. Now, we spoke a little bit about the difference between color theory and how color operates as a pigment in practice. In other words, what actually happens when you're taking colored pigments, which is what paint is, let's say red paint, yellow paint, blue paint, and mix them together. You don't always get exactly what you're supposed to get in theory when we're talking about color theory. So as I said a week ago, in theory, yellow, blue, and red should give you all colors in the spectrum. In practice, you're going to find that that doesn't happen because there's a difference between the physical substance of paint, which is what we're using, and color theory, which is based on the way light functions, or the way color as it's created by light operates. So they're actually two different, they're related, but they're not exactly the same. So as an artist, you just have to get used to exactly how pigments work, as opposed to how colors are supposed to work in theory. Having said that, it's a very good, it's very helpful knowledge to know how colors are supposed to work in theory. Now, I'm not necessarily saying people have to study color theory in depth. I never have. I've never studied book-based color theory in depth. I don't even have a particular desire to, but I've certainly come to know color theory just based on my own work and my own painting practice, quote unquote. Kind of hate that word. And knowing the basics of color theory is very useful. There are color theory classes that are offered, and I would recommend taking them. But knowing color theory in great depth, I don't think is necessary, except as it applies to your individual painting practice. Okay, so again, this is a kind of traditional color wheel. And this is the color wheel that most of us are taught in things like high school classes, I think. It's certainly the color wheel I was taught. Now, like I said, we are taught the idea that these three traditional color primaries can yield any other color. It turns out, again, that that's only true in theory and not in practice. There actually is the color primaries are often referred to as color triad. There is another color triad, or a set of primaries that in some ways actually allows you to mix a broader and maybe even more accurate range of colors. Anyone know what that is? It's actually a color triad that we encounter in sort of, not in everyday life, but in non-art contexts. Anyone know a different color triad?
Is it the one on the computers?
Yeah, it's the one on the computers. What's the color triad on the computers?
I think there's cyan in there.
RBG.
Yeah, cyan. And was someone else said something?
Is it RBG? Red, blue, green?
No. So that's a third one, and that's a fascinating one, which I will get to. That is another color triad, RBG, red, blue, green. So there is a color triad where three colors will get you any other color, but completely counterintuitive to us as painters. That color triad is red, blue, green. So we're going to get to that. That just sort of underscores how complex color is, and in a way, how fugitive color is. In other words, how difficult it is to pin down exactly what color is. But I'll talk about that in a minute. To go back to Alyssa's,
I think it's cyan, magenta, and yellow.
cyan, magenta, and yellow. That's right. So another color triad is the one we're looking at here. Cyan, magenta, and yellow. So as Alyssa said, you often encounter CMY colors in the computer. You also, CMY is a color triad that was invented for printing in the 19th century. It was a color triad that printers realized could create the greatest range of colors when you add black to it. CMY plus black. And that's also the basis of color photography, CMY plus black. Our artists can also use that color triad. This color triad, a version of cyan, a version of magenta, and a version of yellow, allows you, in some senses, a greater range of colors than red, blue, green, which is the traditional color triad. That's a terrible example of a spectrum green. So we're actually going to try both of those today, in addition to our dead color triad of earth red, earth yellow, and blue black, or Payne's gray. That's another color triad that I think is useful for artists to know. Okay. Let me address one thing. I want, Sakina, you sent me the email yesterday about rendering. And I want to address your question, but just a little, and then a little bit more broadly. I want to address something related to that, but as it applies more broadly. So Sakina and other people have asked me about how to successfully, how to successfully render a form from light to shadow, and how to, and as part of that, how to successfully blend color. So there's a couple of things about that. One, I mean, I'll talk about that more, and I will show people, I'll go back to that because people, have asked me about it, different techniques for blending, for rendering tone and blending the paint. I do want to emphasize that part of that is not something I can express verbally. I can show you the way I do it. But a big part of that is simply deciding you want to do it and doing it over and over again. Like manipulating, when you think about, let's just take this pear here, and then think about the paint we've been using. like the paint that comes out of the tube, it's this blob of colored oil, right? It's this formless kind of, it's a formless, greasy, slippery, messy blob of colored oil. It's actually a kind of mud because we get these pigments from the ground and then we mix it with a liquid, right? It's kind of a refined version of mud. And then we take this stick with hairs at the end of it and we try to transform that blob of color using this stick with hairs at the end and transform that into something like this. And just think about that, how difficult that is going to be, right? To make the transformation to this slippery material, to this image that makes us believe, at least to some extent, that this flat surface is somehow a tabletop with objects on it and light, and not only that, but a specific kind of light. Like we know that this is cool daylight coming in from a window. You know, so to achieve that, there's no getting around the fact that it takes a lot of practice. And so I just point that out because I don't want people to get frustrated by the difference between what you want to do and what you're able to achieve right now. You've only been doing, you know, you're taking a painting class. For many of you, this is your introduction to painting. You've maybe never done it before. I think I can say that for sure. For sure, some people have never used oil. So there's going to be, at this point, a big gap between what you want to do and what you can do. And it's simply a question of practice. And I do also, I think it's important to emphasize that for artists in general, that to be a successful artist, like whether you're painting this way or you're painting in any other way, like, so we're painting in a certain way, right? We're working towards developing the skills to make successful illusionistic paintings in a kind of traditional manner. That's a specific set of skills. You know, as I've said many times in the class, I think that these skills we learn, both specifically for this kind of thing, but also much more broadly, you know, have a very wide application. But let's say we're trying to do a different kind of art. So this is a contemporary painter named Larry Pittman, who I think is a really interesting contemporary painter. This is a painting of his from around 1990. I don't remember the title off the top of my head. It's a complex title. So I'm going to tell you a little story about Larry Pittman. So Larry Pittman went to CalArts in the 1970s. He graduated in 1976. CalArts is an art school. It was quite famous at that time. It still is, but not quite like it was at the time. CalArts was actually the art school that Walt Disney started in order to train animators. It eventually became like an art school with a full range of offerings. So Larry Pittman is a very well-known, a very successful contemporary artist. He's actually become quite wealthy from his art. Not that that matters, but I mean, just to underscore, he's a very successful contemporary artist. He's probably now 65. Actually, I think he's 68. I think I just read that he retired from his teaching job, and I think he's 68. I met Larry Pittman about 30 years ago. And when Larry Pittman graduated from CalArts in 1976, his desire was to be a painter. That's how he wanted to make a living. But it's very difficult to make a living as a painter, right? It's not like you can graduate from art school and go out and apply for a job as a painter and get one and then start your retirement account and all that, right? That's not how it works. It'd be nice if it did, but it's not. So Larry Pittman got a job as a salesperson in an interior design store in Los Angeles. And he worked there when he was first out of art school. He worked there full time in order to pay the rent. And he eventually worked up to like a designer in the, or a design consultant, something like that. But he worked full time in that design store at the Pacific Design Center in Los Angeles. He did that for 10 years, 40 hours a week. And then after his workday, he would go home and paint. You know, he had a studio. And it took 10 years after art school for him to establish himself as a painter and make contacts. And I think after 7 or 8 years after art school, he got a gallery who was showing his work, but he kept his full-time job. And he kept doing the full-time job and then painting at nights and on weekends. And eventually, after having worked full-time for 10 years, he had saved up 2 years worth of salary. And so he said to himself, I'm going to see if I can make it just as a full-time artist. I have 2 years of salary in the bank, and I'll see if I can make this happen. And it turns out he was able to do that. He started selling his work enough, and he was able to, from that point on, be a full-time artist. But that was after 10 years of doing one full-time job, and then at the same time, painting at nights and on weekends. And so that's not exactly related to what I was saying about the practice that is necessary in order to achieve the kind of techniques that you want to achieve. But it's related, right? Being an artist, being successful as an artist, either in achieving the techniques you want to achieve or achieving success as a practicing artist, takes an enormous amount of practice and an enormous amount of commitment. And I actually don't think that's emphasized enough to artists in art schools anymore. It isn't at Queens College enough. So it takes an enormous amount of practice and an enormous amount of work to eventually be successful as an artist. And again, the primary reason I say that is because people should not be frustrated that right now there may be a difference between what you want to be able to do and what you're able to do, right? Because it just takes like learning these skills, seeing these skills, and then, just by practicing doing it over and over again, you eventually develop, the manual skills, the relationship between mind, what you want to do, and hand, right? That's part of what we're doing as artists, right? The developing that relationship between mind and hand. Like if you think about playing an instrument, let's just say a violin, there's a relationship between what the violinist wants the sound to be and then how they can manipulate their hands and the violin and the bow in order to make that structured, ordered, and ultimately beautiful sound come out of that instrument. And for an artist, it's just like a musician. It takes an enormous amount of practice. So one, don't be frustrated. Two, realize that it takes an enormous amount of practice. And, within the context of your life, decide how you can commit to that. So these are two images I wanted to show. It's sort of related to what I've been saying. I went to, when I was in high school between junior and senior year, I went to a summer session at Rhode Island School of Design, which is an art school in Providence, Rhode Island, which isn't too far from where I grew up. And I've always remembered this anecdote I'm about to relate to you. So we were, as part of that summer session, I studied illustration at that time, actually. That's what I thought I wanted to do. And it was a kind of, I think it was like a month-long intensive sort of introduction to the art school experience for high school students. And it was actually a great experience for me. And by the way, for any, there are all kinds of summer programs like that people could look into. And we had an art history class as part of that program. And I remember sitting in the art history auditorium waiting for the class to start, and there was a fellow student in the same row that I was in, and he was drawing in a sketchbook. And the art historian came in and he saw what the student was drawing, and he said to the student was drawing a fantasy figure in his sketchbook, I remember, out of his head. And the art historian said to that student, he pointed to a pipe on the wall, a pipe and fixtures and connectors on the pipe. And he said, it would be better if you, instead of just drawing out of your head right now, if you drew the complexity of that pipe, you'd learn more from that. And then he got up on the stage and to start the art history lecture, and he put these two images up. This is Michelangelo's drawing of the Libyan Sibyl and Picasso's self-portrait from about 1920. And he said to the students collected in that auditorium, he said, your job is to draw every single day until you can draw as well as those artists. So showing these two images of two artists who, many people would consider among the greatest artists ever. And I've always remembered that. And I think that that is generally accurate, that to be successful as an artist, you have to make a complete commitment, and you have to somehow figure out a way to draw every single day. However you're able to make that work in your life. And I want to emphasize that because, again, I don't think that level of commitment is emphasized enough. Being an artist is not something that just happens because you take some classes in art school. It's a complete, total commitment, which ultimately, if it's something you love, provides you with a great deal of pleasure and fulfillment. It may not provide you with a job immediately after school. And I think that that's a kind of reality that people who are studying art should embrace. Now, I hope that's not depressing to anybody. That's simply the reality of being an artist. And it used to be something that was very commonly emphasized to art school students. Like I had teachers who said, count on taking 10 years before you're successful as an artist. So I think that's worth pointing out. Okay, so any questions about any of that?
No, thank you.
So what am I gonna do here? So, new share. Okay, I'm gonna start with this in 1 second. Sorry, I forgot to put up my brushes. I'm just getting my brushes. Okay, so of course, we talked today about the color wheel. We are going to study color according to the basic principles of the color wheel, but we're going to be using color stars. I use color stars because I think that making a color wheel adds all kinds of challenges, like in getting the wheel accurate and getting the divisions accurate. I think it's much easier to use a color star, and it gives us certain opportunity to experiment with color in a way that's perhaps a little bit more applicable to the kind of painting we're doing. So what I'm going to be asking people to do is make 3 color stars in which you are going to investigate how 3 different color triads work, or what 3 different color triads can yield for us. And by doing that, start to introduce yourself to a wide range of possible color mixtures. So I'm going to ask you to make a color star using the traditional color triads. So blue, red, yellow. In our case, the colors we'll be using are ultramarine blue. And then if you bought the colors I asked you to, it would be primary red and primary yellow. And then I'm going to be asking you to do a version of the cyan, magenta, yellow color triad. So cyan, magenta, and yellow. And then I'll also be asking you to do a color star using the color triad of Payne's gray, transparent red oxide, and yellow ochre. So when we do that, so we're going to be doing using those color triads to first make our secondary colors, just so that it doesn't. I don't include the tertiaries. I could, but I don't, just because I think people will understand the tertiaries as violet, blue, and I want to give people enough time to get these 3 done without adding too much complexity to each of these. But we could add, certainly, the tertiaries. So we're going to be mixing our secondaries, and then we're going to be mixing a small sequence of grays towards a middle gray in the center of each of the color stars. So I'm going to show you, I'll paint 1 color star as a demonstration to show you how to go about doing it. And then I will be giving this assignment, which has a soft due date of Monday. If you need more time, that's fine. So this is something you should try to plan on doing between now and Monday. Okay. So I'll walk you through the process of making one of these color stars. So we're going to trace out this on one of our pieces of canvas paper. Okay. So an easy way to do this. So you want to take a piece of your canvas paper. So what we want to do is we want to draw this color star by first establishing a square within our rectangle. And by the way, I'm going to demonstrate this, but I will also post on Blackboard a PDF with very detailed instructions. But I'll show you this, how to do it for now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find a square on our canvas paper. So I'm going to measure. I'm going to measure the width of this piece of canvas paper. I know it's 9 inches, and then I'm just going to mark out on along the long length of the rectangle. I'm going to mark 9 inches at both the bottom and the top. And then I'm going to connect those two marks to establish a square on my rectangle. And then in order to locate this color star, I'm going to mark the halfway point of the top and the bottom edges of my square. And then I'm going to mark quarter points along the left hand and the right hand edge. So I'm going to find the halfway points along the top and the bottom. And since we're working with 9 inches, that is obviously 4.5 inches. And then I'm going to find quarters along the left hand and the right hand edge. So that would be 4.5, and then 2.25, and then 6 3/4. So just dividing that edge into quarters, as well as this edge. Okay, so this gives us the divisions that will allow us to mark out our color star. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to connect. I can start anywhere here. I'm going to first create one triangle.
I'm sorry, Professor.
Yes.
So I just have a quick question.
Sure.
So we're taking the ruler and drawing the actual square, the star this way first, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So I'm just going to connect the bottom 2 quarters to start one triangle. And I'm going to use these points.
I'm sorry, one more. And we're using the canvas paper now, right?
I mean, you're free to use whatever you want. I mean, canvas board would work, but I don't see the point in using canvas board for this. I would recommend
Okay.
canvas paper.
Okay, great.
So I'm going to make I'm going to mark out one triangle. And then I'm going to mark out an upside down triangle. And all of the points that we have used are going to give us necessary points that connect the necessary points to trace out these 2 triangles, one right side up and one upside down, overlapping. It looks like the Star of David, right? Okay, so now what we're going to do is we are going to create these, what look like sort of interior pie wedges. Okay, so we are going to, actually, let me do something else first. Before I do the pie wedges, I'm going to do the circle in the middle. So the circle in the middle that we're going to use to find the middle gray. So I'm going to make a little X in the middle of my, and then I'm going to take a compass and make a circle. Now I know many people probably don't have a compass. Why would you? But you can use any, you could do it by eye. You could, do your best circle. You could also take like a little lid of a container, like let's say a container to, I don't know, what are those iced tea brands you get in bottles? I forget. You could take a
Snapple.
Snapple, like the lid of a Snapple bottle, and use that. Or if you have something like that, use anything to make that circle in the middle. Make it as close to possible right in the middle. If anyone happens to have a compass, use that. Like sometimes we have them. I don't know. Don't we sometimes get them in grade school? Whatever. Okay, now I'm going to make my pie wedges. Now I'm going to make the pie wedges by running the ruler from the deep points along the contour of the star, connecting those. I'm calling these deep points. I don't know what else to call them. So going diagonally across the star. I guarantee you some of you are going to, maybe all of you will screw up in doing this. I mean, I still screw up now and again. Don't worry about it. Just erase it or start a new one. Inevitably, I started by connecting the wrong lines somewhere along the line, so that happens. Okay, so now we have our line drawing, so to speak, of what we're going to be painting. Okay. All right. So. Okay, so we're going to be using these colors. I asked people to buy. So we're going to be making our traditional color star using the traditional color triad. So yellow. I asked you all to buy primary yellow and primary red. I have cadmium red medium, cadmium yellow light. They're very similar pigments. It does the same thing. We're gonna use ultramarine blue. We're gonna be doing a color star with the turquoise. I probably didn't ask you to buy cadmium lemon, did I?
No.
No. So just use primary yellow. That will work perfectly well. These are really interchangeable primaries. If you want to get a little bit more exact, this cadmium lemon is a little bit better, but it doesn't matter. And then quinacridone magenta will be our magenta. Turquoise will be our cyan. And then we'll be doing a color triad using, whoops, I have a list in crimson. Yellow ochre, Payne's gray, and transparent red oxide. Okay. So this aside, I will demonstrate a color star using the traditional primaries. I'm not going to do a demonstration of all three. There would be no point. I'll demonstrate one, but then you're going to take that principle and do all three color primary sets or color triads.
Professor, could you read off the paint names again?
Sure. So the colors you will be using um, will be for the traditional color triad. It's going to be primary yellow, primary red, and ultramarine blue.
Is primary red like cadmium red hue?
Yeah, if that's what you got, it's cadmium red hue. Yeah, is that what I asked you to buy, or did I ask you to buy primary red?
I think you asked for cadmium red.
Okay, sorry. So cadmium red hue. And did I ask you to buy primary yellow or cadmium yellow hue?
I have
Primary yellow.
and cadmium yellow light. Does that make a difference that it's light?
Cadmium, no, that's fine. Cadmium yellow light is good. Um, so, okay, forgive me if I'm not remembering the color, exactly the colors I asked you to buy. By the way, cadmium, in case anyone wonders what it means when the word hue, H-U-E, is attached to a color name, cadmium colors, so colors that come from cadmium, a heavy metal, those are expensive. So so paint companies make versions of those colors that are made from less expensive pigments. So if you ever see the word hue attached to a color name, let's say cadmium yellow hue or cobalt blue hue, that means that they have approximated a color, typically because the pure form of that color is very expensive. So for example, there's a particularly beautiful blue called cobalt blue. A tube this size would cost something like $200, at least. With certain brands of paint, it's more. So they make inexpensive versions of those. And for most purposes, the inexpensive version works fine. So cadmium yellow hue, pure cadmium, primary yellow, those will all work. Cadmium red for the traditional primaries, or primary yellow, that will work fine. Okay, and then for the traditional, it would be ultramarine blue. Now, hopefully that wasn't terribly confusing. So are the traditional primary colors, is that clear?
Yes, that's clear.
Okay.
The yellow for the other one, is it the same yellow?
Same yellow, yep. For this color triad, it's the same yellow. So there should be no variation here. This should be turquoise, your yellow, and then quinacridone magenta.
My magenta tube looks a lot darker than yours. It's called primary magenta, but it looks really dark.
That's okay. Yeah, that primary magenta will work. Okay, is that, I apologize. Is that what I asked you to get? Okay.
I think so.
Okay, but primary magenta will work. And you can add a little bit of white to it if you want to bring it up a little bit more to what appears to be a kind of pure color. So I'm going to put a little bit of this paint out. Magenta. So your primary magenta is darker than that?
I think so.
So if you
I haven't opened it. I'm just looking at the tube color.
Yeah, that's sometimes not accurate. But it may be darker, but that's fine. And you can just add a little bit of white to it if you want. And then for the dead palette primaries, we're going to be using yellow ochre. So this is a different yellow ochre. And then the colors we've already used, transparent red oxide and Payne's gray. Okay.
So we're making 3 stars?
Yes, making 3 stars. Yep.
All of the colors will be posted, right?
Yes, they'll all be posted, and I'll post examples of all 3 color stars with the colors listed on them. Okay, so So actually, let me just put out, so I'll put out all three color triads. So we have, I'll start with the CMY. So I have my magenta, my yellow, and our version of cyan, which is turquoise. And sometimes when paint has been closed for too long, it's hard to open. So put on the primary red. My primary yellow. They're basically the same color. There's a slight, ever so slight difference. You know, this works a little bit better. That's the CMY primary, but they're so close that it really doesn't make much of a difference. And I said that that separation is normal, but that's a little extreme. You know, if that happens, if you have a tube of paint where that's happening, sometimes what I do is I put out, I'll use something like this as a blotter. I'm gonna put the paint on the blotter. And then that soaks up that extra oil. And I let it sit there for a few minutes. Okay, so very straightforward, very basic. We're just going to start filling in these pie wedges so that we can start building our colors. So I'm going to start with red. And where exactly each of these goes doesn't matter so much. Well, you need to put the primaries on each corner of the triangle, but exactly which corner doesn't matter. We're starting with red. I think that this is a very helpful exercise, and I used to be insecure about doing this exercise because I thought students would find it dreadfully boring. But I've actually found that students find it very relaxing. But students, for the most part, I experience them that they really enjoy this. It is a kind of relaxing thing to do. So, Sakina, I think you also asked me about like how much of this medium to use when blending. You know, that's all. That is something that's a kind of personal preference. I mean, you shouldn't use too much medium, but medium is not. It doesn't really apply to blending. You know, there are artists who make very, very completely blended paintings and don't use any medium at all. And then there are artists who use more medium. So medium is not so much. That's not so much the issue in developing the ability to successfully render light and shadow. It's more identifying those elements and then just practicing those techniques of merging the tones. You know, when I personally think, this is just the way I do it. I dip my brush into the medium. I just use a little bit of medium. I don't know exactly how to explain it because it's more like a feel for it and not any kind of exact proportion. At least not any exact proportion that I'm completely aware of. It's something that I would just recommend people, if you're interested in using media, I would just recommend experimenting. I will say that you should avoid using too much media. But you know, I have to admit, even that I don't have like a scientific definition of what too much media is. Although I did hear in one of those YouTube videos, one of those artists who does them said that you should never use more than 1/3 medium to 2/3 paint. I have no idea if that has any scientific backing. So I have my red. I'm going to paint in my yellow. So red, yellow. So the ultramarine blue out of the tube is quite dark. You could use it out of the tube, but if you want to, if you want the ultramarine blue to appear a little bit more like a conventional color wheel blue, you can add a little white to it. I like to do that. I think it just gives, if nothing else, a better looking color wheel. You know, you approximate a color wheel blue. This, you know, this is not, at least I don't approach it as some kind of exact science. You know, you want to get a decent color wheel blue, sort of middle value blue. It's just a little bit dark. But, you know, it doesn't. It makes such a dark violet and such a dark green that you feel like you're not quite looking at color. And you can also, if you do find that your primary magenta is very dark, you can just add a little bit of white to it if you want to bring it up a little bit more to a, you know, what seems to be a color wheel magenta. Okay, so we have our 3 primaries. Now we're going to mix our secondaries. Okay, so here's where we're going to start seeing the limitations of pigment as opposed to color in theory. So I'm going to make a violet. I'm going to bring in my secondary violet here. Let's see what happens when we try to mix a pure violet using our color wheel blue, or our primary blue, and our primary red. So we get a violet. We get a kind of violet, but it's not that it doesn't mix up to be the pure, vibrant violet that you often see on color reels. In some ways, like you might say that that's a more beautiful violet. There's something about that kind of, I don't know what we would call it, sort of dusky gray violet. But it's certainly not that pure, vibrant violet. And there's no way with these two colors that we could ever get a very vibrant violet. It's just not going to happen. So you're going to find that if you just start out with a set of color primaries, you aren't able to get those pure colors. Now let me show you something with a different set of primaries. If we want to get a very pure violet, we might try the cyan, magenta, yellow primer. So let's just try that. So with those primaries, we get actually a much more vibrant violet.
Yeah, that looks bright. That looks good.
So you can certainly get, you can mix virtually all colors that you want to mix, but you're never going to be able to do it if you just use 3 primaries. You have to expand your range of pigments to do that. Now, some people may be wondering why not just use these primaries. And some artists do. Some artists just paint with those 3 primaries, the CYM primaries. The reason I don't is because I think this is entirely true, at least for the most part. The pigments that are required to get these colors create very transparent paint. Whereas these pigments, you're able to make much more opaque paint.
Professor, I'm trying to switch devices, please. Thank you.
That's good. You get much more, again, you get much more opaque paint. And I don't like always using transparent paint. In other words, paint where it's difficult to cover over layers of the painting. So just in terms of like all the things you can do with paint, you're somewhat limited if you just use those 3 primaries. And I think it's good to—
Professor,
Yes.
so would you say that wasn't a good purple then? We should stay with the other purple you created?
Yes, for this, when you're working with a set of color primaries, you want to just use those to get all of the other colors.
Oh, wow.
That's so that you see, and you get as close as you can. That's so that you see what these colors can do. Because this may be a more vibrant violet, but depending on your purposes, that may be a more useful violet. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yes,
you
I
need
do.
that kind of color more than you need this kind of color. So you want
We're using only blue, yellow, and red to get the colors that we need.
on this color, yes, on this traditional color primer, yeah, or color star.
That was cool how you did that though. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to add our violet. This is our kind of relatively grayish violet. I happen to think it's a very beautiful color, but it's a kind of gray violet. I happen to like I happen to like kind of gray colors. And I know on your screen, that looks even duller than it does to me in my studio.
And Professor, the paint number you're using is a 0 or a number 2?
The brush,
The brush, I'm sorry.
in this case, it's a number 1.
Oh, it's a 1. Okay.
But with your brushes, like the 0 or the 2 would be fine.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So we have our violet. And now we'll see what do we get when we mix our green. So we'll take our primary yellow and our blue. We get a nice green. So with these primaries, the blue and the yellow make a green that I think is more pure than the violet is. And now I'm going to make my orange. And so with these color primaries, we get a very vibrant orange. So each of the color primary sets will do different things. And if anybody's wondering, you can, of course, in doing your regular paintings, you can mix all these paintings together. I assume that's obvious. for the color stars, you want to stay with those sets of color primaries. But when you are using all of these paints to do your own paintings, you can obviously mix all these color primaries interchangeably.
And the best way to mix is with that knife, right?
I'm sorry?
The best way to mix would be with that device, correct?
Well, that's one of those things that's somewhat dependent on preference. If you prefer to just mix with your brush, there are some artists who do that. Yeah, I mean, when you use a palette knife, it's easier to make a little puddle like this.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to have that, especially when doing.
I was just wondering, based on you doing that, if it was like a more clean thing or what?
Yeah, I think it does keep the colors a little bit more clean
Okay.
because it's
Thank
easy
you.
to wipe off that knife with like a paper towel or a piece of toilet paper, and then
Mm-hmm.
you can dip a very clean knife into the paint. Where it's harder to get your brush clean in between dips, you know what I mean?
Mm.
So I do find that it helps keep your colors more pure.
Okay. I did figure that out yesterday.
But there are artists who don't use a palette knife.
Okay. Professor, one more question. To clean your brushes, the best way to do it is in the Gamsol
Yeah,
mineral spirits would be the best way, right?
yeah.
Okay.
I would recommend cleaning with soap and water at the end of the day.
Does it matter the brand of the soap?
No, not at all.
Okay. Okay.
Use any hand soap, any laundry detergent, any dish soap, makes no difference.
Great. Okay. Good. Okay. Thanks a lot.
I've never tried. You can buy brush cleaning soap in an art supply store. I've never tried that because it's more expensive.
I was looking at that.
Yeah,
No, let me ask him first.
someone did recently tell me it works better. I have a hard time believing that, but who knows? Maybe it's true.
Okay.
You know, the only soap I would recommend you don't use is lava soap. Do you know that stuff?
Okay. Okay.
Do you know why I say that?
No, not really.
Lava soap has grit in it, and I guess that's like when you soap up with the bar, it's gritty. There's some kind of gritty substance in it, and they do that, I think, to encourage, like, you know, so that encourages like scrubbing off really dirty hands. You know, I think it may be made for people who are working with cars or something like that. But
Okay.
I think that damages the brushes. So I would just don't use soap that has grit in it.
Okay. Regular hand soap should be fine.
Not a hand soap.
I just was nervous with the whole water thing. Definitely can't wash them with water.
Yeah, I would recommend at the end of the day, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Brushes will last much longer. So you wash them with soap and water, shape them. You know, in other words, like after you've washed them with soap and water, like carefully put them back into the shape.
Okay.
And let them dry. And
Okay.
last much longer. Okay, so we now have a color star with our primaries and our secondaries. And again, I think this is useful to see like what kind of secondary can you make with these different color triads, the traditional, the CMY, and then the dead palette triad. Help you see these. So now we're going to, in the center of this color star, we're going to mix a middle gray using just these three primaries. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our primaries, a little bit of each. And try to get a middle gray. Okay, so that's our first stab at it. That's a little bit too much of a kind of warm purpley color, right? So what do we do? How can we change that so we can maybe get closer to a middle gray? What would we add to it?
More yellow.
Yeah, we're gonna add a little bit of, I was maybe misleading in the way I asked that question. I said that's a kind of purple. But actually, it's a little bit too much of a kind of like chestnut brown. Do you know what I mean? A kind of like, this is purple. This is more of a kind of brownish color.
Right.
I'm sorry?
Yes, it looks brown.
Brown. So, by the way, so you know that you can get a brown by mixing those colors. That's good to know. So I think actually I was misleading there. I'm gonna just by eye, it looks to me like putting a little bit of blue in there will bring it closer to a neutral gray. So you're gonna find that in trying to get to the neutral gray, you're gonna be trying different things. You're gonna sort of struggle with it. Like, how do you mix the colors until you get a neutral gray? But you can get there. You can get close to a kind of neutral gray. So I added blue to it. Now looking at that, that's maybe just a hair too blue. So I'm going to go back to my original brownish color. A little bit of that in there. I'm going to put a little bit of white to make the grayness more apparent. And I think we're doing pretty well. What do people think? What do people think of our gray?
Looks pretty good.
Yeah.
It looks
Yeah, that last white should do it.
It looks pretty neutral.
Yeah, it looks pretty neutral.
Yeah,
It may
neutral.
not be an exact match for a neutral gray.
Mhm. So we can add white. That's good to know.
You can add white. Yeah. Like I said, this is 5 is a neutral gray right here.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah, she was dead on.
It's pretty good. And you know, I said earlier that this is not, we don't have to treat this as some kind of exact science. In other words, we don't have to arrive at something that's absolutely determined as a neutral gray somewhere, if that's even the case. We just want to start seeing what we're able to do with these pigments. So I think that this gives us a good idea. the kind of gray we can mix. And so this is a very useful thing to remember. So you're going to find that if you're perceiving a gray in some kind of setup, that it may not be the case that you can get that with black and white, because when you mix black and white, you get a very particular kind of gray. You might need a slightly warmer gray, a cooler gray, or just a gray with some other particular color characteristic. So starting to know the different ways you can arrive at grays, I think is very useful. And now what we're going to do following that is we are going to now progressively mix each of the colors towards the gray by mixing it with this opposite. So I'm going to make a transitional middle hue between pure yellow and gray by graying down this yellow with a little bit of its opposite. So I'm going to gray that yellow down with a little bit of violet. I'm going to put our middle gray aside right there. I'm just going to clean up my palette a little bit. By the way, for people who use a palette knife, you always want to be careful with a palette knife, because as you do this with the palette knife over and over again, what you're actually doing is sharpening this edge. So that edge is actually pretty sharp. I have on several occasions wiped my palette knife clean and cut right through the tissue and cut my fingers. So you want to just be careful with using a palette knife. They do get sharp. They get sharp and they actually eventually wear down.
So, Professor, you could use the plastic ones as well?
Yeah, they don't work quite as well.
Okay.
You can use them. They wear down. So this palette knife here used to be the same size as the one on the left. But just through constant use, it just that whole section of it there is taken off. So they do wear down. You sharpen the blades as you work them. Not intentionally, but it happens. So just be careful with that blade.
Great tip. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry?
I was just saying thanks for the tip.
Oh, sure. So, then again, I cut my fingers all the time. Anyone else do that? Like, I'm constantly cutting my fingers when I'm doing dishes or preparing food. Maybe I just have a tendency to do that. So I'm going to, we're going to now go, we have our primaries and our secondaries, and we have our neutral gray. So I'm gonna progressively gray down each of the primaries and secondaries by mixing with each of those colors a little bit of their opposite. So I'm gonna make a slightly gray yellow by taking my yellow and then mixing into that a little bit of the violet. So I'm making a slightly grayer yellow. Now again, this isn't a science. So the objective of this is not to achieve some kind of absolutely determined gray yellow, but we're just seeing how primaries and secondaries function with each other and help us create different shades and different hues. So that to me seems like a useful, it's not very clear, a helpful idea of a gray yellow. Maybe that's a little bit dark. Maybe I'll put a little bit more yellow in it. And what this actually, I think why this is particularly useful is that you're going to see colors now that will be very useful to us in this particular kind of painting we're trying to learn, which is a kind of observational painting. So if you remember, I mentioned that, for example, when you're painting something like a lemon and asking yourself, well, how do I achieve the particular color that I'm perceiving on the shadow side of a lemon? This may be a very good solution to it. So I think when you see the colors that you mix, and then think about these colors when you're actually observing objects in the world that you're trying to paint, I think this might give you some clue as to ways you can achieve some of the colors that are perhaps a bit more difficult to identify when we're looking at them on an object. And that's particularly true when we're trying to determine what color an object is when we're perceiving it in shadow. Because we're pretty good at identifying local colors. In other words, the local color of a lemon is yellow. And when a lemon is adequately illuminated, we are pretty good at identifying the local color of the lemon. But it's much harder for us to determine what the color is on objects when we're perceiving them in shadow. So if we have to identify what the color is of a lemon in shadow, that can be much more difficult. And I think if we bear some of what we learn here today in mind when we're looking at objects, it can be very helpful. Okay, so I have my primaries and secondaries, my middle gray, and now I have one wedge of a gray yellow. It looks a little bit green. That's okay. So I don't know if that's a little bit, yeah, you can see that a little bit better. So I have my gray yellow. I'm now going to go to the other side and make a gray violet. So I'm going to take my violet and add a little bit of yellow. So I just want to make sure, because sometimes this is a little bit unclear to people. Everyone follows what we're doing here. We're graying down our colors, our primaries and secondaries. So the gray violet is going to be within the same color family as the gray yellow, but it's going to be a little bit darker, and it's going to be a little bit more of a purple than the gray yellow is. The gray yellow is going to be a little bit more of a yellow. So this could maybe be a little bit more yellow, just to make a little bit more of a clear differentiation. So I'm going to do that, and I'm not going to do it because I'm striving for some kind of absolute, to achieve some kind of absolute matches according to some ideal standard. But I just want my color star, these variations to appear to be distinctly different from one another. So I'm going to make my gray yellow a little bit more yellow, just so it reads as a little bit more clearly distinct from my gray violet. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
And while we are not attempting to achieve, a match for some assumed absolute standard that exists out there, we do want these wedges within the center of the color star to each be different from the other. So that is something you do want to adjust for. So, and again, just to emphasize what I think the value of doing these mixtures is and just using one example, I think that you'll find once you complete your color star, and then let's say you complete your color star and then set up a lemon in a light source, and then look at the color of the shadow on the lemon and compare it to the colors you've mixed here by graying down yellow with its opposite. I think you'll find that these colors, may not be exactly the color in the shadow of the lemon, but they're going to be approaching it. It's going to give you a good starting point to arrive at those colors, or a reasonable equivalent of those colors. And that's just taking one example. Okay, so let's do the same thing with our other colors. So I'm going to make a gray orange by taking my orange and mixing in a little bit of blue.
Professor,
Yes.
I think someone's in the waiting room.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, so we now have our gray orange. Now again, as I said, we're not striving for to match some absolute standard that exists out there, but you do want to make sure that each of the color wedges is clearly different from one another. So sometimes that's a little bit harder to achieve than we may think. So if your color wedges are starting to look the same, just make whatever adjustments are necessary to one color wedge or the other. Does your orange gray need to get a little bit more orange? Does your gray yellow need to get a little bit more yellow, or whatever the case may be? So I have my gray, orange gray. I'm going to make my blue gray by adding a little bit of orange to the blue. Just slightly neutralizing, and just slightly neutralizing that blue. So it's a blue, but it's just a gray blue. So gray orange, slightly gray blue. It looks very green on the screen. And then again, we will just do the same thing with our red and green. Take my red, mix just a touch of green into it. Just to slightly neutralize that red. Slightly gray it down. And then finally, we're going to add gray green. So we're going to take our green and we are going to just slightly neutralize it, slightly gray it down to a little bit of red. Okay, so now we have a completed color star. Again, this is a color star which we made with our traditional primaries, right? Red, blue, yellow. We mixed our secondaries, or as close to our secondaries as we could get. We made a middle gray, and then we progressively grayed down each of the colors using its opposite. So a gray yellow, a gray violet, a gray red, a gray green, gray blue, gray orange. My gray violet, I think, could be a little bit more violet. I think my middle gray could be a little bit lighter, so I can change those. But again, we're not going for some kind of absolute scientific accuracy. So there isn't a great urgency to get it somehow. I would change those, and I think I will change those. But one thing I do want people to make sure to do is make sure that your grays are all different from one another, right? The gray yellow is different from the gray orange, different from the gray red, from the gray violet, from the gray blue, and the gray green. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
So that gray violet, I'm going to mix just a little bit more violet into that. And what I'm doing here, because the gray violet that I already have down is still wet, so I'm just mixing pure violet into it. So a little bit of gray violet in there. Just so that's a little bit more of an actual violet. That to me was a little bit too close to the yellow, to the gray yellow. Yeah, so I think that's much better. And I guess I could see that a little bit when I just had that gray violet down, but it's when the other colors are around it that it was much more clear. So I think that works better now as a clearly different from the gray yellow. And like I said, I would go in and lighten this a bit. I don't need to do that here in front of everybody. So we have one color wheel. And I think that it's clear the step for the next one. So I will not go through the process of each of them. But so you want to make a traditional color wheel using the traditional color primaries, a CMY color wheel, and then a dead palette color wheel. And so you'll be able to compare and understand all of these different shades and hues that you're able to mix with these different color sets. Any questions about anything we did today?
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Could you show the dead palette one again?
Sure.
That's the cyan one?
I'm sorry? What was the, I'm sure the dead palette. So here's the dead palette color wheel. And obviously with the dead palette color wheel, you get a more narrow range of hues and shades, right? So we use Payne's Gray as the blue, transparent red oxide, and yellow ochre. And then we mix them in exactly the same way. So we mix what we can, as close as we can get to an orange, using transparent red oxide and yellow ochre, as close as we can get to a green, and that is a kind of gray-green, using Payne's Gray and yellow ochre, and then as close as we can get to a violet, mixing transparent red oxide and Payne's Gray. So you get this kind of brown violet. And then we're going to mix a middle gray using these three color primaries. And then we're going to progressively gray down each of the colors, each of the primary and secondaries, using a little bit of the color opposite. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
And we're doing 3, right?
3, yes. So one's color star using dead palette primaries, one color star using traditional primaries, and one color star using the CMY primaries.
And you recorded this, right?
I recorded it. There's going to be a detailed PDF with instructions on how to trace out the color star. And there will be images of each of the color stars that are labeled.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
The CMY, that's the magenta, the turquoise, and the yellow?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
So I will, if there aren't any more questions, we'll end a bit earlier today than we usually do. Take the time to, get as much work done on it as you can. And, I do know that with the way these remote classes go, if anyone needs, I understand sometimes people need more time. Our deadline is a soft deadline for Monday. Get done what you can. And if you need more time, that's fine. Our class ends, as I think everybody knows, next Thursday, and probably grades aren't due until the following Monday or Tuesday. So I'll give everybody until the last day before grades are due to hand in any assignments. So it will probably be, I'll probably have everything due by, let me see something here, Sunday, August 1st. It may have to be Saturday, August 31st, depending on when grades are due, but it's probably Sunday, August 1st. So you'll have until then to submit all your assignments.
Are we still responsible for the board composition, those, because you said,
No, I think I've decided that it's just in an online class, it's just too much work to pile on. I think what I'll do is one day I will talk a bit about composition and ways of thinking about composition, which is a very important part of painting. But I just think it's just something we couldn't quite get into in as full a way as I wanted to. But I'll talk about it in one of these days. Okay.
thank you.
Professor, after class, can I speak to you? This is Michelle Ben.
Sure.
Okay.
And can you clarify one more time just what we're doing for the for these color wheels? Like how many are we doing, and are they going to be due on Monday as well?
Yeah, we're doing three of them. So one with the traditional primaries, one with the cyan, magenta, yellow primaries, and one with the dead palette primaries.
Okay, got it.
And they're due on Monday, but it's a soft deadline. If you need more time, that's fine.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hey, Professor, I had a question. I kind of came into class late. I'm not sure if you marked us for attendance.
I didn't take attendance today because I saw that essentially everybody was here. So I got you.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Bye, Professor. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank
Have a
you.
great